Nobody in that diner could stand him for more than 5 minutes. The manager whispered as the black luxury sedan rolled into the parking lot through the rain. The headlights swept across the windows before fading into the stormy evening, and every waitress behind the counter seemed to tense at once. Some looked away. Others suddenly found reasons to stay busy. Jonathan Hayes had arrived. For nearly 2 years, he had come to the same roadside diner every Thursday at exactly 7 p.m. He always sat at the same booth beside the window. He always ordered the same meal. And somehow, every server who approached his table left feeling defeated. Some said he was rude. Some said he was impossible. Others claimed there was something unsettling about him, something they couldn't explain. The bell above the door chimed softly as Jonathan stepped inside. He was 58 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a black tailored overcoat that looked more expensive than the entire monthly rent of the diner. Rain glistened on his silver-gray hair. His expression was calm, cold, unreadable. The conversations around the room faded. Even the clatter of dishes seemed quieter. Jonathan removed his coat, folded it neatly over his arm, and walked toward booth 7 without acknowledging anyone. "Who's taking him?" the manager asked under his breath. Silence. One waitress suddenly remembered she needed to refill condiments. Another disappeared into the kitchen. A third avoided eye contact completely. Then a voice broke the tension. "I'll take his table." Everyone turned. Sophie Bennett tied her apron tighter and picked up a menu. At 22, she was the youngest employee in the diner. Her blonde bob framed a face that still carried the openness of someone who believed people deserved a chance. "Soph, don't," another waitress warned. "Trust me." Sophie smiled nervously. "How bad can he be?" No one answered. The manager sighed. "Good luck." Sophie crossed the room. Outside, rain streaked down the glass. Inside, warm amber light reflected off polished coffee mugs and chrome fixtures. Jonathan sat staring through the window, as if he were waiting for someone who never arrived. He didn't notice her approach. Or maybe he did and chose not to react. "Good evening, sir," Sophie said gently. "Can I get you started with something to drink?" Jonathan slowly turned his head. His gray eyes settled on hers. There was no anger there, no arrogance, just a sadness so deep it seemed older than the storm outside. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he looked away and answered quietly. "Coffee." Sophie nodded. "Coming right up." As she walked back toward the counter, she couldn't shake the feeling that everyone in the diner had misunderstood him, and she had no idea that this simple decision, walking to booth 7 on a rainy Thursday night, was about to change both of their lives forever. The coffee sat untouched for nearly 10 minutes. Sophie noticed it while pretending to organize menus behind the counter. Most customers took at least a sip within the first minute or two, especially on a cold, rainy night like this. Jonathan Hayes did not. He simply stared through the rain-streaked window, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the parking lot, beyond the highway, beyond the darkness itself. The steam slowly faded from the mug. The diner returned to its normal rhythm around him. Plates clinked. A family laughed near the front entrance. Country music played softly from an old speaker above the kitchen pass-through. Yet booth 7 seemed separated from the rest of the room, as if it existed inside its own pocket of silence. Sophie approached carefully. "Sir, are you ready to order?" Jonathan glanced at the menu for what seemed like the first time all evening. "The meatloaf," he replied. "Mashed potatoes. Green beans." Sophie smiled. "Good choice." Jonathan looked back toward the window. "It is always the choice." The answer caught her off guard. Every Thursday, she asked before she could stop herself. For a moment, she thought she had crossed a line. The other waitresses had warned her not to ask questions. Jonathan studied her face. Then he nodded once. Every Thursday. Sophie wrote down the order and returned to the kitchen, but curiosity lingered in her mind. 20 minutes later, she delivered the plate. The meal looked perfect. The meatloaf was freshly sliced. The mashed potatoes were topped with a small square of melting butter. The green beans were seasoned exactly the way the diner always prepared them. Jonathan thanked her quietly. That surprised her even more. According to everyone else, he never thanked anyone. An hour passed. Sophie continued checking on other tables, refilling drinks and delivering desserts. Each time she glanced toward booth 7, Jonathan remained there. The plate sat in front of him nearly untouched. One bite of meatloaf. Nothing more. Finally, near closing time, Sophie gathered enough courage to walk over. Was something wrong with the food? She asked gently. Jonathan looked down at the plate. His expression softened. No. Then why do you order it every week if you barely eat it? The question lingered between them. Outside, the rain had begun to slow. Inside, the lights reflected across the glass. Jonathan folded his hands together and stared at the untouched meal. For several long seconds, he said nothing. Then his voice emerged, quieter than before. Because 20 years ago, someone ordered this exact meal at this exact table. Sophie felt a chill run through her chest. Jonathan's eyes never left the plate. And every Thursday since then, he paused. I keep hoping she might walk through that door again. The diner felt quieter after those words. Sophie stood beside the table, her order pad forgotten in her hand. Around them, chairs were being turned upside down onto tables as the closing crew prepared for the night. The neon sign outside cast a faint blue glow across the window, mixing with the last traces of rainwater sliding down the glass. Jonathan remained still. His eyes stayed fixed on the nearly untouched plate in front of him. Who was she? Sophie finally asked. Jonathan exhaled slowly. It sounded less like a breath and more like someone setting down a burden they had carried for far too long. My daughter. Sophie pulled out the seat across from him. Normally, she would never sit with a customer. Tonight felt different. What was her name? For the first time all evening, a faint smile appeared on Jonathan's face. It was small, fragile, almost unfamiliar. Olivia. The name seemed to transform him. The cold businessman everyone feared suddenly looked like a father remembering a happier life. She loved this diner, he continued. When she was 15, she discovered it during a road trip. She said they made the best meatloaf in 3 states. Sophie glanced down at the plate. So you keep ordering her favorite meal? Jonathan nodded. Every Thursday. Silence settled between them again. Not uncomfortable silence. The kind that appears when someone is deciding whether to trust another person. Sophie noticed something then. A worn leather wallet sat beside Jonathan's hand. It looked decades old. The edges were faded from use. As Jonathan reached for his coffee, the wallet shifted slightly. A small photograph slipped halfway out. Sophie caught only a glimpse. Blonde hair. A bright smile. A teenage girl standing beside a lake under summer sunlight. Jonathan immediately noticed where her eyes had gone. He gently pulled the photograph free and stared at it. That was taken 3 months before she disappeared. Sophie felt her chest tighten. 20 years ago, Jonathan nodded. She was 17. The old clock above the counter ticked loudly in the emptying diner. Did the police ever find anything? Jonathan looked away. Not enough. His voice hardened slightly. There were leads. Rumors. Dead ends. Every year someone claimed they had seen her somewhere. Every year the trail vanished. Sophie studied the photograph. The girl looked happy. Full of life. The kind of person who lit up a room simply by walking into it. You never stopped looking, did you? Jonathan's fingers tightened around the photo. No, the answer came instantly. Without hesitation. Without doubt. Sophie believed him. Then something caught her attention. Written in faded blue ink along the bottom corner of the photograph was a single word. Not a message. Not a date. Just a name. Sophie blinked. Her heart skipped. The name felt strangely familiar. She had seen it somewhere before. Recently. Very recently. Jonathan slid the photograph back into his wallet before she could study it longer. But the word remained burned into her memory. And for reasons she could not explain, she suddenly felt that this story was far from over. That night Sophie could not stop thinking about the photograph. Long after the diner closed and the parking lot emptied, the faded name remained fixed in her mind. She drove home beneath clear skies, but her thoughts stayed trapped inside booth 7. The next morning sunlight poured through the windows of her small apartment. Usually Fridays were her day to sleep late. Instead, she found herself sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold beside her. There was something about that name. Something familiar. Around noon she finally remembered where she had seen it. Her grandmother. The realization hit her so suddenly that she nearly spilled her drink. A few weeks earlier, she had helped her grandmother clean out old boxes stored in the attic of her farmhouse nearly 40 miles outside town. Inside one box were dozens of photographs, postcards, and handwritten notes collected over decades. Sophie remembered picking up an old photograph and noticing a strange name written on the back. The exact same name she had seen on Olivia's picture. Her pulse quickened. It could not be a coincidence. Or could it? By late afternoon, Sophie was driving along a winding country road lined with maple trees. Golden sunlight filtered through the branches as she pulled into her grandmother's driveway. The old farmhouse sat quietly beneath a blue sky, surrounded by open fields and weathered fences. Her grandmother, Eleanor Bennett, looked surprised to see her arrive unannounced. "Everything all right, sweetheart?" she asked. Sophie forced a smile. "I just needed to check something." Together they climbed into the attic. Dust floated through narrow beams of light cutting across the room. Cardboard boxes sat stacked against the walls exactly as they had left them. Sophie searched carefully until she found the one she wanted. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Minutes passed. Then suddenly she froze. There it was. An old photograph tucked between yellowed newspaper clippings. Sophie lifted it into the light. On the back, written in faded blue ink, was the same unusual name she had seen on Olivia's picture. Her heart pounded. "Grandma," she whispered, "who is this?" Eleanor took the photograph. The color drained from her face. For several seconds, she said nothing. The silence itself felt alarming. Then she slowly sat down on an old wooden trunk. "I have not heard that name in 20 years, she said quietly. Sophie felt a chill move through her chest. "You know who it is?" Eleanor stared at the photograph as though it carried a memory she had spent years trying to forget. Outside, a breeze rattled the attic window. Inside, the air suddenly felt heavy. "Yes," Eleanor finally answered. "And if this is connected to the person I think it is, then someone has been hiding the truth for a very long time." Sophie's grandmother remained silent for so long that the ticking of an old wall clock seemed unusually loud. Dust drifted through the attic sunlight while Eleanor stared at the photograph resting in her hands. The warmth had vanished from her expression. In its place was something Sophie had never seen before: concern. "Grandma," Sophie said carefully, "who is she?" Eleanor looked up slowly. Her name was Margaret Lawson. Sophie immediately recognized the name. It was the same one written on Olivia's photograph, the same one that had triggered this entire chain of questions. "How do you know her?" Eleanor folded her hands together. "Because 20 years ago, Margaret worked at a diner about 60 miles from here, a small place near Lake Ashton." Sophie felt her pulse quicken. Jonathan had mentioned that Olivia loved diners during road trips. The connection felt too strong to ignore. "What happened?" Eleanor looked toward the attic window. "People said Margaret helped young women who were trying to start over. Girls who wanted privacy. Girls who did not want to be found right away." Sophie sat down beside her. "Are you saying Olivia knew her?" Eleanor nodded slowly. "I cannot prove it. But years ago, I overheard a conversation. Someone mentioned a wealthy businessman searching for his daughter. They said the girl had passed through Lake Ashton and spoken to Margaret." The air suddenly felt heavier. "Did anyone tell the father?" Sophie asked. Eleanor gave a sad smile. "Small towns keep secrets. Sometimes people think they are protecting someone. Sometimes they are simply afraid of getting involved." Sophie looked down at the photograph again. 20 years. 20 years of unanswered questions. 20 years of Thursday nights spent staring through a diner window. "There is more," Eleanor said quietly. She reached into the box and pulled out a yellow envelope sealed with age. The paper was worn, and the corners had curled. "I found this years ago after Margaret passed away." Sophie carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a receipt from a roadside diner near Lake Ashton. The date made her breath catch. It was from the exact week Olivia disappeared. Beneath the receipt was a handwritten note. The ink had faded, but several words remained clear. Sophie read them twice to make sure she was not imagining them. Then her eyes widened. The note mentioned a teenage girl. It mentioned traveling alone. And at the bottom was a sentence that made her heart pound harder than ever. "If her father ever finds this, tell him she was safe when she left." Sophie slowly lowered the paper. Neither of them spoke. Outside, the afternoon sun slipped behind a cloud. The attic dimmed. Somewhere far away, Jonathan Hayes was probably counting the days until another Thursday night, waiting beside the same window, holding on to the same hope. And for the first time in 20 years, Sophie believed there might finally be a path toward the truth. Monday arrived with gray skies and a steady wind that pushed fallen leaves across the streets. Sophie spent the entire weekend thinking about the envelope, the receipt, and the note. Every time she closed her eyes, she imagined Jonathan sitting alone in booth 7, unaware that a forgotten piece of evidence had survived for 2 decades. By Tuesday morning, she made a decision. She could not keep this to herself. Yet she also knew she could not simply hand him the note without understanding the full story. Questions still remained. Too many questions. After finishing her morning shift, Sophie drove to Lake Ashton. The small town sat beside a calm stretch of water that reflected the pale autumn sunlight. It looked peaceful, almost timeless. Main Street contained only a few businesses, most of them family-owned. Some had been there for generations. Sophie parked near an old bakery and began asking questions. Most people remembered Margaret Lawson. Everyone described her the same way. Kind, private, helpful. The type of person who listened more than she spoke. But when Sophie mentioned the missing girl, reactions changed. Eyes shifted. Conversations became shorter. Doors seemed to close. It was as though an invisible line had been crossed. Late that afternoon, she entered a small antique shop near the edge of town. An elderly man stood behind the counter organizing old photographs. When Sophie showed him the copy she had made of the note, his expression immediately changed. "Where did you get this?" he asked. Sophie hesitated. "Do you recognize it?" The man nodded slowly. "Margaret came in here many years ago with a young blonde girl." Sophie's heart raced. "You are sure?" "I never forgot them." He adjusted his glasses. The girl looked nervous. Not frightened, just uncertain, like someone standing at a crossroads. Sophie felt every word settle heavily in her chest. "Did you hear their names?" The man thought for a moment. "No, but I remember one thing." He opened a drawer and removed an old guest ledger once used by local businesses before everything became digital. The pages were yellow with age. Carefully turning them, he stopped at an entry dated 20 years earlier. His finger rested beside a signature. Sophie leaned closer. Her breath caught instantly. The handwriting matched the note from the envelope. "Exactly. Margaret signed that," the man said quietly. Then he pointed lower on the page. And this name was written directly beneath hers. Sophie's eyes widened. The signature was not Olivia. It was someone else. Someone completely unexpected. Someone who might explain why the search had failed for so many years. As evening shadows stretched across the town, Sophie stared at the name, realizing that the mystery was growing larger than she had ever imagined. And somewhere deep inside, she felt the first real spark of hope, that the truth was finally beginning to emerge. The name in the ledger belonged to a woman called Rebecca Monroe. Sophie had never heard it before, yet the reaction of the antique shop owner told her it mattered. A great deal. The elderly man leaned back slowly and folded his arms. "Rebecca lived outside town back then," he said. "Quiet woman. Kept to herself. People rarely saw visitors." Sophie carefully copied the address written beside the signature. It was located nearly 12 miles north of Lake Ashton along an old county road. By the time she left the shop, the sun had already begun sinking behind the trees. Long shadows stretched across the pavement as she drove toward the address. The road narrowed until it became little more than a ribbon cutting through fields and forest. Finally she saw it. A modest white farmhouse standing alone beneath a cluster of oak trees. The property looked peaceful, well-maintained, timeless. Sophie parked and sat quietly for a moment, gathering her courage. Then she walked to the front porch and knocked. Several seconds passed. The door opened. A woman in her early 60s stood there. Her silver blonde hair was neatly tied back. Her eyes were cautious but kind. "Can I help you?" Sophie swallowed carefully. "Are you Rebecca Monroe?" The woman's expression changed instantly. Not fear, not anger, recognition, as if she had been expecting this moment for years. "Who sent you?" she asked softly. Sophie explained everything. The diner, Jonathan, the photograph, the note, the 20 years of waiting. Rebecca listened without interrupting. When Sophie finally finished, silence settled between them. Then Rebecca stepped aside. "You should come in." The farmhouse interior felt warm and inviting. Family photographs covered the walls. Books lined the shelves. The scent of fresh coffee drifted from the kitchen. Yet Sophie's attention locked onto one frame sitting near the fireplace. Her breath caught. The photograph showed a younger Rebecca standing beside a teenage blonde girl. The same girl from Jonathan's wallet. Olivia. Sophie stared in disbelief. Rebecca closed her eyes briefly. I wondered if this day would ever come. Sophie slowly sat down. Her heart pounded so loudly she could hear it. "You knew her?" Rebecca nodded. "Yes." "What happened?" Rebecca looked toward the photograph. Emotion filled her voice. The story Jonathan believes is not the story that actually happened. Sophie felt the room grow still around her. 20 years of assumptions. 20 years of searching. 20 years of grief. Rebecca reached into a nearby drawer and carefully removed a sealed envelope. The paper had aged, but it remained protected. Untouched. She placed it gently on the table between them. Olivia left this behind, she said, and it was always meant for her father. Rebecca stared at the envelope for several seconds before sliding it across the table. The room felt impossibly quiet. Outside, the last light of day faded beyond the farmhouse windows. Sophie carefully picked up the envelope. The paper was fragile with age, its edges softened by 20 years of waiting. "Why did you never send it?" she asked. Rebecca lowered her eyes. "Because Olivia asked me not to. At least not right away." Sophie felt her heart sink. "What do you mean?" Rebecca folded her hands together. When Olivia arrived here, she was exhausted. Not physically, emotionally. She loved her father more than anything, but she believed she could never live up to the life everyone expected her to have. Sophie listened without speaking. She did not run from her father, Rebecca continued. She ran from pressure, from expectations, from feeling like she was disappointing everyone around her. The words hung heavily in the air. They were so different from the story Jonathan had carried for 2 decades. Sophie slowly opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. Several pages. The ink remained clear despite the years. Rebecca nodded toward it. "Read the first page." Sophie's eyes moved across the paper. "Dear Dad, I know you are going to be worried. I know you are going to search for me. But please believe me when I say that I am safe. I just need time to find out who I am when nobody expects me to be perfect." Sophie stopped reading. Her throat tightened. Rebecca's voice softened. She planned to return. Then why did she not? Sophie asked. Rebecca stood and walked toward a bookshelf. From a small wooden box, she removed several photographs. Sophie looked through them one by one. Olivia smiling beside a lake. Olivia working in a bookstore. Olivia standing outside a small apartment. Year after year after year. She had been alive. She had built a life. She had grown older. Sophie's hands trembled. Jonathan never knew. Rebecca shook her head sadly. "No." Then she pointed toward the final photograph. Sophie froze. The image was recent. Very recent. The woman in the picture was no longer a teenager. She appeared to be in her late 30s. Blonde hair. Familiar eyes. The same smile from Jonathan's wallet. On the back of the photograph was a date from only 6 months earlier. Sophie's pulse thundered. "She is alive," she whispered. Rebecca nodded slowly. Tears filled her eyes. "Yes." For a moment, neither woman spoke. 20 years of grief. 20 years of unanswered questions. 20 years of Thursday nights spent waiting by a window. And now the impossible truth stood before them. Olivia Hayes was alive. The only question remaining was whether Jonathan was finally ready to hear it. Thursday arrived beneath clear autumn skies. The diner looked exactly as it always had. The same parking lot. The same glowing sign. The same booth beside the window. Yet everything felt different to Sophie. For the first time since she had met Jonathan Hayes, she carried answers instead of questions. At exactly 7 o'clock, the familiar black sedan pulled into the lot. Jonathan entered wearing the same dark overcoat. He nodded politely to Sophie before taking his seat at booth 7. The ritual never changed. Coffee. Meatloaf. The seat facing the door. Waiting. Always waiting. Sophie approached with the envelope carefully tucked inside her apron. Her hands felt unsteady. "Good evening," Jonathan said. "Good evening." She placed the coffee in front of him. For several moments, she simply stood there. Then she reached into her apron and laid the envelope beside his cup. Jonathan frowned. "What is this?" Sophie sat down across from him. "Something that belongs to you." The moment his eyes landed on the handwriting, all color seemed to leave his face. His hand trembled slightly as he touched the envelope. "No," he whispered. "That cannot be." Sophie said nothing. Jonathan slowly opened it. The diner noise faded into the background. Customers continued eating. Dishes continued clattering. But inside booth 7, time seemed to stop. His eyes moved across the first page. Then the second. Then the third. Tears gathered before he reached the end. He read Olivia's words again and again as though afraid they might disappear. "Dear Dad, I love you. I always will. I just need time to discover who I am. None of this is your fault. Please do not stop smiling because of me. Please do not stop living because of me. Jonathan lowered the letter. His shoulders shook. 20 years of grief. 20 years of guilt. 20 years of believing he had somehow failed the person he loved most. And now, in a small roadside diner, those walls finally broke. Tears rolled down his face openly. He did not try to hide them. Sophie simply sat beside him. Quiet, patient, kind. The same way she had been from the beginning. After several minutes, Jonathan looked up. She is alive, isn't she? Sophie smiled through her own tears. Yes. Jonathan closed his eyes. A broken breath escaped his chest. Not sadness. Relief. Pure relief. Months later, Booth 7 remained occupied every Thursday evening. But the man sitting there was different. He smiled more. He laughed sometimes. And one spring afternoon, a blonde woman walked through the diner doors. Jonathan stood before she even reached the table. Sophie quietly stepped away and gave them privacy. She never heard their first words. She did not need to. The tears said everything. Before leaving that day, Jonathan handed Sophie a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. It contained no check, no contract, no extravagant gift. Only a simple message. Thank you for serving more than a meal. You gave a father his daughter back. Sophie folded the note carefully and smiled. Because she finally understood something priceless. Sometimes the most important thing a person can offer is not money, power, or answers. Sometimes it is simply the willingness to care when everyone else has stopped looking.